It's a fool's errand to try to convince you that the media is unbiased.
And it certainly doesn't help when the WikiLeaks dump of emails from the Clinton campaign shows that someone leaked a debate question to the Clinton campaign during the primary, and that a reporter for the New York Times at least indicated she was going to read one of her stories to the campaign spokesperson off the record before it went to press. We'd like to think these were isolated incidents, but I'm sure many of you don't. So here's what I'm going to do instead. I'm going to do a story about media bias to show you how incredibly hard it is to do a 100% unbiased story about anything.
And when 207 is over, Caroline and I are going to do a live talk back on Facebook. We'll be taking your questions about this story.
So, you ready? Here we go. Let's start with the accusations. And for that, I turned to frequent media critic and executive director of the Maine Republican Party, Jason Savage.
I can go for days talking about facts that are not being covered.
Immediately, I'm faced with an issue. Savage is armed with plenty of anecdotes to support his claim.
I remember in the first state budget the governor proposed, I remember working with a newspaper reporter and showing them something repeatedly and saying, you understand now, right? That money is, nobody's going to throw Granny in a snowbank. And that reporter went again and wrote another false article.
Now, I could go one by one to every single reporter who he says ignored an important detail or an important story and get their side. That'd be fair, right? But the thing is, we'd really be here all day, and TV does have its time limits. I also could do a statistical analysis, going and looking at which stories seem to favor Democrats more and which stories seem to favor Republicans more. But again, I would be using my own judgment there, and that's kind of against the whole point of this story. So suffice it to say that Savage believes that mainstream media organizations, particularly the newspapers, tend to do more stories that favor Democrats over Republicans, and he feels like his side isn't always well represented.
I think it's much more that it's easier to write a story that takes that liberal worldview. I think that there's a lot of intentional institutional bias.
But conservatives are not the only ones who say the press isn't getting it right. Mike Tipping is a liberal blogger and the communications director of the Maine People's Alliance.
I think there's a difference between unbiased news and some of what we've seen lately, which is certain politicians getting away with lying all the time.
Good morning.
Tipping says media outlets, particularly TV stations, tend to broadcast things that Governor LePage says without fact-checking them first. Tipping, for instance, was the first person to point out that Governor LePage misstated both Maine's minimum wage and the federal minimum wage during one of his town halls last year. That story was covered later, but Tipping believes bad information gets out fast if news outlets report first and fact-check later.
He needs to be on a tape delay. It is not going to harm the voters or the viewers of Maine if they hear about it in the morning instead of an hour later.
So we've got a critique from the left and the right. Balanced, right? Not quite. Tipping actually said he feels like the media did a pretty good job, and if we're being honest with ourselves, we know that Republicans tend to be far more critical of media bias than Democrats. That Gallup poll done in 2015 bears it out. 55% of Democrats said they trust mass media. Just 32% of Republicans did. Pretending that criticism is equal would be what's known as a false equivalence. That's pretending that two things have equal weight when really they don't. And that's a trap that people like me trying to give equal weight to all sides can get into, according to Dan Shea, who's the director of the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs and Civic Engagement at Colby College.
And the reason why that happens is you don't want the flack, right? You don't want the calls and the emails and the letters saying, oh my gosh, why didn't you give the other side of the story?
Shea studies public policy and media for a living.
Good evening.
He says the mainstream media likely isn't any more biased than it used to be, but we as Americans are.
We filter the information that we see on the news through our partisan lens. So if it's a story that fits with our ideology, it's a good story. We believe it. It's contrary to our existing positions. There's something wrong, probably a bias.
This act of information filtering is known as confirmation bias. We only believe evidence that backs up what we already think. So we may notice when the press seems to be against our point of view and see that as bias, but not consider the press biased when it confirms our thoughts.
So the declining trust is linked with this partisanship. How can we break that? I don't know. Well, figure it out. Caroline, you let me know.
That said, Shea is not completely willing to let news outlets off the hook.
There's no denying that reporters lean to the left. They're mostly Democrats. Absolutely. It's pretty easy to measure. You just ask them their party affiliation. There are a lot more Democratic reporters than Republican reporters.
Side note, this was actually news to me, as I wasn't under the impression that most reporters acknowledged any party affiliation. But anyway.
So is that evidence of a bias? Well, maybe, but on the other hand, the owners of media outlets, the publishers, and to some extent the editors, are much more conservative. So scholars have worked really hard to try to find that sort of a bias, and it's difficult to find. Historically, what they find is that there's a bias against incumbents and not necessarily a party.
Interesting, right? Unbiased? Well, sounded down the middle to me, and as I mentioned, Shay studies this stuff for a living. But I did ask, and Shay is a registered Democrat. So, does that change your opinion of what he had to say? Because using professors who happen to be Democrats as unbiased sources tends to be a thorn in Savage's side.
And what we get a news segment that has a Republican, a Democrat, and then a Democrat professor who agrees with the Democrat. And over, that's how it works.
Savage suggested that I talk to Jonathan Reisman, a professor who's worked at the University of Maine in Machias since 1984. He's run for Congress, he studies environmental policy, and he is a frequent media critic. He's also, it goes without saying, a Republican. We talked over FaceTime because I'm based in Portland and I wasn't able to get to Machias for this interview.
Media bias has been around for a long time, and usually it shows up more in what's omitted, what's not said, rather than what's said. What I think has really changed is people have gotten a lot better at recognizing it because we've had the internet and a variety of news sources.
It's almost the inverse of Shay's point. People have more access to partisan news, and so they find it easier to recognize in mainstream sources.
It's much more evident because of the net and because of the variety of sources people can get. And people aren't afraid to point out where things are not being reported.
Reisman also agrees that bias probably is not on the rise, and he has some advice for people looking for balance.
I recommend diversity. I listen to Maine Public Radio every day, but I also make sure to listen to Fox News and some of our local broadcasts as well. If you are just listening to one, you're not getting the whole story.
I, of course, advocate only watching News Center. I'm kidding. Well, unless my boss is watching. Hi, Brian. Anyway, you've hopefully seen by now that reporters can really twist themselves in pretzels trying to get all sides. I mean, is it really fair to say that a professor can't give an unbiased view of media because of his own political beliefs? Some people might feel that I unfairly attacked the credibility of both Dan Shay and John Reisman because I balanced them with their party affiliations. Others might say it was important to hear from both of them. I think you get my point, so I'm going to stop. Did I catch all the pitfalls? Feel free to let me know. But here's where I'm going to show my bias. I think a bunch of people are going to see the words media bias online and comment without actually watching this story. So what I want you to do is write the words, I watched the story and at the beginning of your comment. That way I know at least you listened. We'll be right back.